All right, y'all, welcome back. This is going to be the final lecture for Unit 2. This is Chapter 6 of the intro book, Energy Related Market Forms, right? So, we're going to be talking about the types of market forms that exist. And the four types in the intro, obviously, are going to be natural monopolies, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and perfect competition. Usually, economics operates under the perfect competition sort of assumption. That's how most economics is discussed. But there are also these other forms where um, the supplier, under monopoly and oligopoly um, forms of markets, can affect the supply, the pricing, these sorts of things, right? Okay. Section 6.2, economies of scale, right? This is just the idea that costs per unit of output decrease as more units are produced, right? So instead of building 10 cars, we're going to build 10,000, and it's going to cost us less per unit produced because we're building so many, because we get these sort of efficiencies of scale, right? Um, and these are some of the ideas behind some of the functions of government, even, right? Like teaching in the classroom. Instead of just having individual parents teach their individual children, we get efficiencies of scale by putting everyone sort of together. Building highways, right? Instead of, each town or city sort of building out their little piece or whatever, we get sort of cost effectiveness and efficiencies of scale by having the federal government or whatever put down miles upon miles or hundreds of miles of highway, right? And you get cost reductions because you're buying in bulk. You get cost reductions because your workforce is building expertise. All these sorts of things that go into efficiencies of scale. Um, there also exists sort of under the same concept, efficiency of scale, but this is efficiency of density, right? When the considerations are geographic, right? And so it would make obvious sense, monopoly often sounds like a bad word, and it can be. But sometimes it's really the only effective way to provide a product, right? If you consider something like fiber optics or like gasoline distribution, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense for 5 to 10 different companies at every region to be competing and putting in their own pipelines for distribution, um, or all of these different like cable companies putting in their own fiber optics, right? It makes a lot more sense when the infrastructure is so vast and spread out to have sort of a monopoly situation and just have it be monitored by a government or organization or something like that to make sure that the worst case scenarios of a monopoly don't come true, right? Price gouging and abusing, your customers, these sorts of things, right? Okay. Um, let's see. Yeah, as I was saying, like you can imagine putting in pipelines for like oil distribution, right, or petroleum distribution, but having 10 different companies run their own sets of pipelines in the same area just does not make sense and will increase costs drastically and probably drive a lot of those businesses out, or a lot of them just will never enter the market because there's no profit to be made, right? And so in some sense sometimes you have to have a monopoly. um, and then, in another sense, this is one of the purposes of government, right? To ensure that these goods can make enough profit for the company to want to continue providing this product or service, right? But also not such a massive profit that they're gouging customers, causing inflation problems, reducing supply to cause, pricing upticks, these sorts of things, right? And so there has to be a nice happy balance there somewhere. Okay. Section 6.2.2, economies of scope and economies of vertical integration. So here's where we really talk about sort of mergers and acquisition side of economics and of sort of corporate business politics and economics. Mergers and acquisitions are generally about economies of scope, or especially about vertical integration, right? Instead of paying some other company to do, um, okay, I guess I should just throw out an example. Let's talk about gasoline, right? So if I'm a gasoline distributor, instead of paying some company to do the refining downstream before it gets to me, maybe I want to vertically integrate with a refining company so that we can sort of save costs in the long run, right? So I'll own not only the refining capabilities, but then also the distribution side, right? And so this is one of the reasons that companies tend to sort of participate in these mergers and acquisitions, right? Having a larger market share from a scope perspective can reduce costs, right, and potentially bring savings to consumers, right? When it's costing you less per unit, then potentially those savings are going to get passed on. And this is a lot of the argument behind sort of the current media and entertainment mergers that we're seeing under the sort of contemporary Trump administration, with this agglomeration of media companies, with the sort of hyper wealthy buying up newspapers and cable outlets and all of these sorts of things, right? And it's been one of the main arguments for social media companies being able to sort of just snatch up apps left and right, right? Like, I guess, you know, I can't remember. Is it Google that owns like WhatsApp and all of these sorts of things? Um, and, skeptics would say, look, it's just a way for you to get rid of competition in the market, while the companies themselves and their lawyers would say, no, look, it's about economies of scope and vertical integration, these sorts of things. So you have to figure out sort of which side you're on, I guess. Um, let's see, vertical integration, we kind of talked about just having a company at every point of the manufacturing life can tend to reduce costs. It can also allow you to sort of specify the products that are being made a little bit more easily. There's a little irony here, though, in that a lot of American companies that snatch up other companies or merge or acquire other companies, etc., they will make the claim that these acquisitions are for vertical integration and cost savings, but then they will immediately turn around and subsidiarize them to reduce legal risk and to reduce the power of labor and unions, right? And so, again, again, it kind of depends on which side you fall on this sort of thing. You also have to find a balance between sort of monopoly pricing and efficiencies, right? And this is where often like the Justice Department will come in. They will review whether a monopoly is necessary, either in the total economy or in like a regional economy, et cetera. And if they say, okay, a monopoly does seem like the most efficient sort of market form for this company, we are still going to keep an eye on you to ensure that things like price fixing does not occur, collusion between companies does not occur to, maximize profit shares, these sorts of things, right? Okay. I would also, the final thing I wanted to point out about this sort of mergers and acquisitions and vertical integration and all of this sort of discussion is that a lot of times these things can also lead to, yes, they may lead to reduced costs and increased efficiencies, but also they can have an effect on the job market, right? Where once a company acquires another company, often there are big job cuts, and under the claim that we're duplicating efforts or et cetera, et cetera. But if this continues to happen, you get higher unemployment rates, right? Okay. Section 6.3 is just sort of a review of the monopoly form of markets, right? And monopolists obviously have a lot of power, right? They can control the supply, and then they control the price. And they can control the price in two different ways. First of all, they could just say, like, we're the only people you can get it from, so we're going to set the price, period. Or they can reduce the supply to move up the demand curve, basically, which will kick up the price, right? And so by artificially limiting the supply of a product, given that demand is stable, the price will inevitably rise, right? Okay, what causes a monopoly? One is control over resources, right? And so petroleum obviously is a good example of this. For the longest time, petroleum was only really economically viable, although it existed in other places, but it was really only economically viable in the Middle East, right? And so that's why OPEC had such a powerful organization for a long time, which we'll talk about later in the chapter. And then I would also point out things like lithium, cobalt, all of these sorts of rare earth minerals, which are also going to be vital to sort of the energy markets in the future, also tend to be concentrated, right? It's not like they're spread out evenly across the planet. And these things can lead to monopolistic tendencies, right? Another reason for monopolies can be that the government just simply states that we're going to allow this monopoly to exist, right? And so, if you think about things like nuclear material, right, we don't want a whole bunch of companies out there digging up nuclear materials and then wondering, shit, where did some of it go, right? And so we keep a very close watch on that industry. The same with like military weaponry, right? There are a few companies that take contracts from the United States, but we don't sort of just let anybody build out military style weaponry. And so those are sort of examples of when the government will get involved and say there are strategic reasons to set up a monopoly industry, right? Okay. The third is economies of scale. So this is like the Walmart effect, right? Where the economies of scale have become so great that prices for that particular company are so low that they can drive out any other competitors in the industry, right? And so this is sort of the argument for the Walmart effect, that they would come in, undercut prices for a couple of years, drive out all the mom and pop stores, and then rise prices back up, right? And so this can be very concerning, and this is the type of thing that the Justice Department really gets involved in, right? And then I would also add, I wanted to add a fourth, which is cost of entry, right? Because energy tends to have such an extraordinary level of upfront investment costs, it can be very difficult to get competition in the market, right? Especially once companies are already established. Getting new companies into that market is often extraordinarily difficult, right? And so this is not only sort of oil and maybe refinery and things like that, but it's also like a couple other examples would be like the space exploration industry right now, right? There's only really two or three companies, and really only one of them is viable, right? SpaceX, from all of the sort of economics that I read, companies like Blue Sky, et cetera, aren't really competing in that space, right? And then airlines also, right? This is why we really only have two major airline companies on the planet: Boeing, based in Europe, and excuse me, Airbus, based in Europe, and Boeing, based in the United States, right? And so this is one of the big concerns about Boeing performing so poorly in recent years, is that this could be a massive knock on our economy and our ability to strategically compete when the cost of buying into and building out an airline manufacturing company is extraordinarily expensive, up in the multiples of billions of dollars, right? Okay. Section 6.3.1, application, resource rent in the hydropower sector. Um, I guess I just kind of wanted to point out that this term rents is usually how economists talk about profits, right? And excessive rents are those in monopoly situations, et cetera, right? Um, and they can cause real problems. A lot of you who sort of wrote about the resource curse, right, in paper one, talked about the Dutch disease, which is problems with, your capital, right, your currency becoming too valuable because of these sort of um, minerals or petroleum or whatever it might be. Also tied to Dutch disease is the idea that your economy becomes less diversified over time as the extreme rents or the extreme profits, whatever you might want to call it, show themselves in these sort of resource markets, and companies sort of bail out of other industries, right? And then when the resources fail eventually, or you see a major drop in prices or whatever it might be, now your economy's in trouble because you're less diversified than you were to begin with, right? You also have problems with corruption, right? Theft of resource rents, these sorts of things, and the political side of the resource curse, where you don't really have to worry about good governance and taxation because you can just sort of snatch money out of the resource market. These countries tend to have higher inequality as well, right? And it can lead to conflict, where rebel groups or whatever it might be see the fantastic money being sort of drawn out of the system and going into particular people's pockets or politicians' pockets or corporate pockets, whatever it might be, and want a piece of that themselves, right? Um, okay, let's see. We'll move on to the next section. We'll skip all this like rate of return, la la la. Okay, let's move on to the final section, kind of the oligopoly section, section 6.6. So oil markets are a really good example of oligopoly. This isn't a monopoly because it's not just a single sort of corporate entity, but there's only a handful, right? And so they can actually affect each other's decisions, and they have an easy time colluding together to limit supply to drive up the price, right? And OPEC is definitely sort of an oligopoly or a monopoly if you consider them as sort of a single uh, entity. I know they're not, but there is sort of an idea that they work in tandem, right? Okay. Section 6.6.1 is about cartels, right? So, yes, the same sort of terminology we use for drug organizations can be put on OPEC, right? And cartels are defined as a formal organization created by states in order to jointly define prices, quantity supplied, and market share, right? And this is generally where antitrust laws come in to break up cartels, prevent collusion. Um, but enforcement is tough, right? Like we often don't actually see enforcement of these sorts of things, especially for the ultra rich, right? And so this was a problem post 2008 crash. No one really ever was held accountable for it, right? People walked away with millions or billions of dollars from this complete collapse of the system. Taxpayers had to kick in to save these too big to fail or whatever. But no one ever went to jail on this sort of thing, right? And the I don't know, Congress hasn't really been interested in fixing the problem since. We've actually, in recent weeks, we've seen a couple of sort of suppliers to automotive companies showing some of the same problems that we're seeing post 2008, where they have access to extraordinary credit. They're out there on the private market snatching up credit. Apparently, there may have been sort of getting credit from multiple different sources using the same assets as collateral. These same issues that we were seeing in 2008 are starting to show in the cracks again. And so there's some very, very nervous investors, including Jamie Dimon, who runs, God, what company is that he runs? One of the major banks. I cannot remember which one, but I read a lot of his stuff. So anyway, there are concerns that we're heading back in that direction because the Justice Department and others just aren't enforcing these rules that are on the books, right? There are also a few sort of structures that favor cartels, right? So, of course, there's few sellers, right? That's part of oligopoly, right? There are barriers to entry. So, this is the extreme cost in investment we talked about in chapter 4. And there's also inelastic demand. So, that's why, again, drugs tend to fit this cartel model. but so does petroleum, right? Because you can't just say, like, I'm just not going to buy gas tomorrow, right? Or drug addicts can't really just be like, I'm not going to do heroin today. It's too pricey, right? It doesn't really work like that. We have very, very inelastic demand. Okay, let's see. The last section is sort of on OPEC. So, the original members of OPEC were Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and Venezuela. You'll notice that some of these countries despise each other, right? So, like Iraq and Iran went to war against each other. Iraq and Kuwait went to war against each other. That's why we got into the Iraq War One in the early 90s under the first Bush. Um, so, there are internal problems, right? OPEC controls about, depending on the time frame, anywhere from 30 to 60% of the market share. And data shows that the higher OPEC's market share of the petroleum market, the higher the prices of petroleum, right? And that is purposeful. Let's see. OPEC's power has been waning, though, and there are a few reasons for this. One is technology is improving, allowing access to petroleum reserves in places that were not, basically in like Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, like petroleum's just like laying there. It's like right there. You kind of just go scoop it up with a spoon. It's incredibly cheap to pull out of the ground. But it's not necessarily like that in, say, West Texas or in Nigeria or off the coast of Brazil or Guyana, these sorts of places, right? But there are many, many more resources being pulled out of the ground because of technological advances. And the West, in large part, is trying to move away from OPEC, right? Post COVID, when we learned some sort of some issues with our supply lines, right? Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for being here. I'll get the paper two up ASAP. Have a great day. Thanks.